What's happening, my fellow geeks and geekettes? Welcome to a brand new episode of Cosplay Chris. And in today's video, we're going to be assembling, painting, and finishing this beautiful Mohawk bootleg. Yes, it is a bootleg model kit from Gremlins 2, the new batch. Now, this is based off a pre-existing, very rare Japanese model kit that was created in 1990 with the release of Gremlins 2, the new batch. It is cast off one of Rick Baker's Mohawk puppets from the film. The only thing missing is the actual Mohawk, but, and this is my personal preference, I actually prefer the look of Mohawk without the Mohawk. He is very crudely assembled and just held together with little dabs of hot glue from a hot glue gun. Just to give you guys an example of what we're going for and the aesthetics. So I'm actually going to disassemble him, heat him up with a heat gun and melt that glue back because we have to fill in all these areas here. See, the hands are separate, the forearms, bicep, tricep, the ears, head, torso. And we're also going to foam fill him. So to be sculpting in all the seams here and blending them all in, we're going to be using epoxy sculpt. Now, I got to use this stuff before, and the great thing is it gives you time to work with it and you can wet it, smooth it down a lot like clay. In about 24 hours, it is fully hardened. Now, I'm also going to be foam filling this guy. We're going to be using our foam 200 from Barnes. So with a lot of foam fillers, you can get what's called S foams where it is soft and squishy, but with our foam, it's rigid. And with the 200, it is like lightweight concrete. Because a lot of people have given me advice when it comes to these and said you need some sort of a structure or some really rigid foam in there because sometimes the vinyl can warp over time, especially if it's in sunlight or whatnot. So I'm actually going to keep the feet and the legs attached to the torso, but for now I'm going to take the arms, the head, and the ears off, and we're going to start seaming, patching, and filling in all those joints. And then we're going to start bit by bit to foam film this guy. Now, originally I wanted to do all the paint work by hand, but I think it's going to be a mixture of airbrush work and also hand painting, possibly using oil colors. Because you look at the paint work on Mohawk, it is very intricate, very detailed, and very involved. And a lot of it is airbrush work, and there are some areas where there's no way you could do that by hand. You need an airbrush to get in all those nooks and crannies, especially when it comes to the base colors where it shifts from, say, like a green to a beige or a white or a bone white for that matter. I am aiming to do the eyes by hand. It's probably going to be a bit tricky because of my shaky hands, but I like a challenge. And we haven't done a build video on here for quite some time. You know, I've been a bit busy, kind of got married and doing other things, working on the second channel. I did do, I wouldn't call it an unboxing, but it was more or less just showcasing this piece on the second channel, the Chris Stanley channel. But for this video, this is going on the main channel. Of course, we're going to finish this guy off because I've always wanted one of these. Given the fact that the original model kits go upwards of like $2,500 to $3,000 Australian dollars, this is the closest I could get to obtaining one of these because they're just so rare. And when they do pop up on eBay, they go for an absolute mozza. So I'm actually going to disassemble him right here. We're going to be using a heat gun or a paint stripper gun. So like I said, I'm going to leave the legs on the torso, but I'm going to take the arms, the head, and the ears off. And then we're going to get to work patching, seaming, foaming, and put him together. All right, so we're going to start to add some epoxy sculpt to all these seam lines here. Now, again, what I love about epoxy sculpt is the amount of time you have. So it does have the working time here. You know, you got your 30 minutes for sticky and most adhesive, 1 to 2 hours, easy to work with, 2 to 3 hours setting up formable detail, 24 hours hard, cured, and waterproof. And again, you can use water on this to smooth it all out, which is going to be perfect to blend it all into all this beautiful detail and recreate some of the scales and whatnot. So I've only got a little bit here. Hopefully I can get away with using part A, part B all up, not only on the hands, but obviously behind the ears, the torso, and bring it all together. Now, once this particular step is done, I'm going to coat the entire piece in a primer, but we're also going to be filling it with our foam 200. Now, when it comes to epoxy sculpt, you just want to make sure you get even part A and even part B and knead them together like dough. Like, it's a full-blown workout for your fingers. But once you're good to go and we start sculpting those details back in, it was just a matter of grabbing some sculpting tools that say you use on clay sculptures and stuff like that to re-sculpt those scales, make sure you've got good coverage. And the great thing is, like I said before, you can use water to soften it and blend it back into the surface. So I grabbed a scourer sponge, or I think everyone else calls it a Brillo pad, if I'm not mistaken, and smooth it and blend it back into the surface, and then you can re-sculpt those scales, which quite frankly was pretty therapeutic. And the good thing is it sets in stages, and you've still got a good couple of hours working time where it is soft, malleable, and pretty much like water-based clay, and then 24 hours later it is hardened like a rock.
So I've let the epoxy sculpt dry overnight on the arms. Now, before we actually reattach these to the torso and seam them and patch them, I'm actually going to get some supercast resin and pour it in the bottom of both feet. And that way it kind of keeps the center of gravity at bay and also just helps it stand upright. So I'm probably going to fill it about halfway each leg, and then the rest will obviously be the R-Foam 100. Now, once this resin has set, I'm then going to reattach the arms and then get some more epoxy sculpt, do the arms, fill them in, and then attach the head.
Okay, as always with the supercast, mix ratio is 100 to 100. Again, this was just to kind of keep some weight in the legs so it would help him balance accordingly. And I ended up filling up a bit more, like more towards the hips, as you can see right there as it was gelling, trying to get a nice little artistic angle going on. And once we reattached the arms with a hot glue gun, we could get back to work sculpting in and blending everything back together with that epoxy sculpt. Again, this one was a bit more fiddly because there was a bit more detail to fill in as opposed to say the arms. But I found this very therapeutic once carving and sculpting all those scales back in. Now we're going to grab our R-Foam 200. Now the expansion of R-Foam 200 isn't as severe as like your regular expander foams that you'd get from Bunnings Warehouse. It definitely does take several goes, several batches to really fill up those pieces. Now if you see right here, because of the heat generated from the R-Foam, it actually softened the vinyl and cracked the epoxy sculpt in the process, which I kind of thought was going to happen. So all that was left to do was to let it cool and refill it with more epoxy sculpt. But I have an aluminium rod inserted in the head with some more foam. And then what I do is pour the last batch of foam in the top of the torso there, and then stick that pole in with the head on it. And once it was all lined up and set, we were gonna fill in the blanks when it comes to the neck and the jowls there and sculpting all those detail lines and like the sagging skin lines. So this was probably the fiddliest process, but once he was all dry, we cut to the next day and it's time to prime, or should I say it's time to prime. So I'm just going to grab a Rust-Oleum white primer. This is actually one of the best ones to use when coating a vinyl surface. Like I know I've used this one plenty of times in custom collectibles, but Rust-Oleum is definitely the one that bites the best when it comes to vinyl surfaces.
Alrighty, so I've let this guy sit for a good 2 days just to really let that primer spray bite onto the surface. So the next step is, before we get to airbrushing, now ideally and originally I wanted to do all of this by hand, but unfortunately if you wanted to get it as accurate as possible, like the true look of Mohawk, you gotta airbrush it. But we're firstly gonna do a wash. So I'm gonna get some good old-fashioned shoe polish. Unfortunately, it is really tough to find Kiwi shoe polish these days, which is a bit of a sad thing. So we've got Smart Brown shoe polish to start off with. So I'm gonna water some down in a cup, not too much, but you don't wanna use undiluted shoe polish on this because it may stain the surface way too much. We just need a light brown wash, not only to get in to all the nooks and crannies, but also to kind of lightly stain the surface. Because from what I've seen, especially on the biceps and the ears, there is a nice brown stain on the surface. Not so much on the torso area, it's a bit more lighter, bordering on like a fish belly white from what I can see. But then there are other photos where the belly is indeed like a brown. So I guess it honestly just varies on what your look is of Mohawk. There are probably a bunch of different paint jobs that weren't exactly all the same when it came to the actual screen used puppet. So First step is we're gonna do a wash over the entire piece, getting all those nooks and crannies, all the beautiful detail. And we're gonna let that dry for about a good half day, just to make sure all the little crevices and stuff like that are fully dry. And then we are gonna get to airbrushing this guy. I'm really excited and nervous at the same time.
So you want to know what was a happy little accident when applying this wash? It actually gave me the perfect coloring for a starting point on the torso and the belly when it comes to adding the dots and the greens and stuff like that. Again, a happy accident. I didn't plan it, but the overall wash just gives the whole piece a nice starting point and essentially just a beautiful blank canvas. But as we dab away that excess, you can see the texturing and the detail it's picking up. And again, it's a perfect starting point for when we apply the greens on either side and then eventually the dots. And I'm not gonna lie, this definitely was the fiddliest part. I thought the epoxy sculpt was, but getting in all the nooks and crannies and the awkward angles because it's such a solid piece and it's sharp, and we got there in the end. It took a good hour and a bit, but we got there in the end.
Alrighty, we are now ready to airbrush this beautiful looking bastard. So again, I wanted to originally do this by hand, but if we're gonna do this the proper way, the way Rick Baker and his crew painted the original puppets, we got to airbrush him. There may be a few instances where I may touch things up here and there by hand with, say, an acrylic paint or an oil color, but for the most part, we're going to be airbrushing this guy. So we're going to be using a combination of Ammo brand and Air AV paints. So these are airbrush paints. They still need to be diluted a little bit. So if we do have to do that, we have from Liquitex the airbrush medium. So you're able to water down without losing the consistency of the color. So I've tried my best to figure this out in steps because there is a lot going on. Not only when it comes to the Gremlins, but most notably Mohawk. So I'm going to be starting off with little bits of veins and brown veins and stuff like that, mostly on the ears, but also little bits on the hands and the feet, but also misting on some brown on the hands and the feet as well. But for the most part, it's going to be about the ears. So I've got a combination of blue, I also have a hull red, and I also have a sand brown. So we're going to be doing a combo of these. Obviously, we're going to be doing some blue veins through the ears. This isn't a transparent vinyl, but with a bit of veinage, it gives you the illusion that it's thin ears. Also going to be doing some brown highlights on the brows here and there. Then the next step is grabbing a dark green airbrush color. And that's when we're going to start to airbrush a dark green on the sides, the obliques, certain parts of the head. We've got to get that pattern formation going, and also around the back. Now, once that process is done, I can then start doing the dots on the scales just using a matte black. So we're going to be blending in onto the torso here. So I am actually going to be getting a lead pencil and marking out the exact coordinates of the diamond formation that he has on his torso, on his chest for that matter. But also we have the blend of big thick dots, thick gauge dots going into small little dots on the torso. So again, this is going to be a massive learning curve for me. I've never done something like this. I'm nervous, but so excited at the same time. Then after that, on the back, there's a big yellow strip, and then there's highlights and white highlights. I'll be doing a running commentary throughout the entire process. Again, I've tried to divide it into sections to make this process as efficient as possible. Haven't even gotten to the eyes yet. The eyes is a later problem. I'm leaving that till last because I'm no good at doing eyes. So keep an eye out for that one. I love you. That's my wife. So I've got my airbrush all ready to go. So we're gonna load up either the blue or the brown and get started on the ears, the hands, and the feet.
So like I said, we're going to be starting off with our browns and our blues. Now, this gave me a lot of practice to dial in the airbrush, even though later on in the video, I really dial it in. But this was also going ahead and like shading like certain parts where there'd be veins, or you see bone kind of dipping down into a valley, like where you see the bone structure on the feet, but also on the ears and the flaps, and going around the outside of the ears to really pick up the kind of chippiness, if that makes sense, of Mohawk's ear shape. And again, this just adds more depth, more layer, more realism, and then I loaded up my blue into the airbrush once this stage was done, and then started the vein work. And don't get me wrong, like the brown is also vein work, but that blue just adds another level of realism to this piece. And as far as reference goes, from what I can see, there's no real other veining going on the Mohawk puppet. For the most part, it is just the ears. And again, we're not dealing with transparency here, but I am grabbing a lead pencil and marking out Mohawk's ear markings, his black and white ear markings. I just want to make sure I got them all right before going over them with a Sharpie and just marking them out. Now, I was originally going to airbrush them, but I hadn't probably dialed in my skills, so I got something else that worked an absolute treat.
All right, so I've just ducked out to my local craft shop. So here we've got Eckersley's. Because what I've figured out is to airbrush those ear lines, and I'm going to end up going out of the lines for sure. So I figured if I get a high-end permanent marker and do the coloring by hand for the inner parts of the ears, but the outer part, the outside of the ears, the back of the ears, I can still airbrush that. Because the patterning there is a lot more forgiving. So I got a Uni Posca permanent marker. Apparently these are pretty good. Wanting something clearly that's streak free. If worst comes to worst, let it dry and then go over it once again. So I got a big one and a smaller one for the finer details.
So like I said, even though I didn't feel confident with airbrushing the ear markings, these permanent markers work an absolute treat. And there was like minimal streaking, which was great. So very happy with the ear coverage there. Now it's time to get to work really detailing this piece. I'm grabbing that dark green and starting to shade in the sides of the torso. And what I've noticed with the Mohawk puppet that Rick Baker and co created is it starts as a light kind of misted green where the pecs are, the obliques are, and as it transitions towards around the back of him, it gets a lot darker. So you build up more of that green. I'm also doing the same on the face, just trying to work the patterns out and obviously using reference of the puppet, and then also going in with my browns once again for the chin. Now I'm also grabbing the red that I showed before for the gills, and also the yellow for the back stripe markings as well, that eventually will have some dots on there. It is quite an intricate bit of patterning going on all over this puppet. And when it came to the fins and the gills with the reds, you've really got to build it up bit by bit, kind of let it dry, because it does start off as a pink and like a transparent pink, and then it goes to more of a stark pink, and then eventually the more you hit it, the more it will eventually turn red, whilst also grabbing a black and just highlighting around the edges those gills and kind of like wisping down the lines there to really highlight the detail of this particular sculpt. So I was very happy with how that particular one turned out. And once it's all glossed all up, it kind of brings it all together, and also just coloring his lip there. So it's very touch and go. Like you're just constantly referencing all the reference photos you have of the puppet and any other stills for that matter. Even coloring the ears like that. So I did opt to color the back of the ears with an airbrush because the pattern was a lot more forgiving than the front of the ears. And to me, the front markings on the ears are a lot more of a showcase than the back of the ears. Not to say that I did a slack job on the back, but also I was able to, because of the forgiving pattern, I was able to use the airbrush that time. And again, just going in and marking all the dots on the back, and also doing the dot process on the front, even his diamond formation pattern, which I think is so unique and so beautiful. And this is where I really dialed in my airbrushing skills. So much so I actually went back and changed the face, which I will address in a minute. But doing all the scales here, again, like with the epoxy sculpt method, it was just so therapeutic and just such a learning curve in terms of how stark you want the dots to be or how light you want them to be.
Now, you're probably looking at this guy and thinking that face looks a little bit different and a little bit more detailed. And you're right. So the original look of the face I was not happy with at all, because I hadn't dialed in the settings on the airbrush properly. And by the time I started detailing this side of the body, I'd really honed in on how to properly dial in the settings, most notably the PSI on the air compressor. The original PSI I had was 50 PSI, but a good operating PSI for fine detail work is usually 25. And once I adjusted those settings, also fiddled with the nozzle in terms of how much paint is coming out, it really dialed in and made everything a lot more sharp. But you can see the original face here, the details are quite soft, especially the black facial markings. So I resprayed the face just a white and then went back in and did the exact same way I did the original face, but everything is just a lot more sharper. This time around, just adding a bit more detail to the scale on the brow here. I'd still have to go back in and do these scales here, so I will show that after this particular clip. But just wanted to make sure that people who are airbrushing, especially finer details, make sure your PSI on your compressor is at about 25 to 30 at max for the finer detail stuff. Now, all that's left to do is do the other side of all these spots, all the scale spots. I also have to do the eyes. So what I'm thinking is getting some liquid latex and masking off around the perimeter so I can do the proper airbrushing and lay down the foundation and also do the pupils by hand. That one I'm kind of nervous about because I really want to line it up and I don't want him looking askew or cockeyed for that matter. Now, in terms of a base, it's going to be simple museum quality and it will not break the bank. And then once that's all done, we're going to seal him up with a 2K sealer just to make sure none of this paintwork scrapes off in the meantime. Now you see some of the facial markings here as well as the ears. So I do have to go around the border with white. And you can see I've already started it right there. And for that, I just got another Uni Posca permanent marker. This time I got white. So that is the next step. And then we're going to start doing the rest of all of the black scaling and the horn detail work.
I swear these whiz-bang permanent markers are my new favorite thing. I kind of equate this to Mike Tyson's face tattoo, these strange cheek and jaw markings on the sides of Mohawk. They're so intricate, intriguing, and I love them. Now, I actually just want to address the horns all over, like, say, his jawline and the back. Those are actually a happy accident from doing the brown stage when it came to airbrushing the whole figure, and it just kind of happened to look really good. And I just went in with the black around the base and some areas, especially on the toes, like when it came to the toenails, and you'll see that footage in a bit, just how well it highlights and just adds a bit more detail. And I'm just going in there and just finishing off the scales on the left side, his left side for that matter. And it is hard, like you got to make sure your settings are dialed in the same as they were on the other side, so all the dots line up. You see there, just grabbing the black and just really highlighting and detailing those gnarly nails and just finishing off the head scales right there. Again, it is such a fiddly process, but it brings it all together. Now I'm just going to drill a hole in his feet, and I'm going to use an aluminium pole, aluminium dowel for that matter. Just grabbing a craft box that I got from Bunnings. This may look familiar. I actually use this for the Batman Batmobile diorama I did 2 years ago when the Batman came out. I'm just going to grab a Rust-Oleum flat black and give it some nice even coverage. This was about 3 good coats. Now it doesn't matter about the actual finish because we're going to be coating that in a gloss automotive paint later on. Now I wanted a little plaque, so I went to Officeworks and printed 2 variations of the Gremlins posters, but I opted for the classic one. And this is actually a cheap acrylic frame you can get from Kmart for a couple of bucks. It's going to be displayed with it. Now I'm just going to grab some liquid latex from Barnes, and this is to mask off around the eyes, so when I go into airbrush, I don't have to worry about getting any overspray on all that hard work and detailed work that I've done on the face. So I'm going to start with coating both eyes with a white, just so we've got a perfect blank canvas. Make sure they're all lined up, looking good. I'm going to go in with the red and get some nice even coverage over both eyes, just to make sure they're full red. And then I'm going to mix the red and the yellow, and then I'm going to apply a bit of orange just to give a bit of depth and almost like a glowing look to the eyes. Now once that was done, I was happy with that. I just grabbed the yellow and then went in and started to lay down the foundation of what eventually will be the pupil, because there is a bit of yellow around the pupil. Once I was happy with that, just grabbed the black and started going for the pupils. And this was the hardest part, trying to line those pupils up. I just grabbed that white permanent marker and also outlined the pupils and took off the masking latex. Now it's time to lower him down onto the display with those cut pieces of aluminium tube. Now this is the spray we're going to be using. This is an acrylic clear coat, Jam and Clear. Now originally it was going to be a 2K sealer, but this is actually a 1K sealer, and it worked an absolute treat. He looks gross and slimy, and now we are ready for the final reveal. And there we go, guys. To say I'm stoked is an understatement. I really tested myself with this one. It was a stressful paint job to do, but I learned a lot in the process. And I'm just really over the moon with how this has turned out. Now, if anything, if I were to change something, I may go back in and fiddle with his left eye. The more I look at it, and I think it is a distortion with the casting, his left eye is placed a little bit high and just skewed ever so slightly as opposed to his right eye. But I think it's also one of those things where I'm looking at it way too much. I've just got to walk the fuck away from it. But I'm definitely glad I forced myself to learn how to airbrush. I've still got many a ways to go in terms of really refining techniques and stuff like that. But now I've learned stuff on Mohawk that I can transfer over to custom collectibles and stuff like that. Speaking of, the next custom collectible is going to be this McFarlane Toys Medieval Batman, which I'm really excited about. Now, you can't really see because it's out of frame, but I also have the little poster plaque down here on display, which is cool. And it's like a little option to have. Ideally, I want to have him in the background of my videos. There's a bit of like empty space here at the moment, so I might get like a little pedestal or something and place him here in the corner. And also scare the shit out of my wife when she comes home. Guys, thank you so much as always for watching and the incredible support. I know obviously things on the channel here are a little bit more quieter these days because I spread out the build videos, and that's why I made the separate second channel. So, you know, so essentially just keeping the talking videos separate from the building videos. Guys, wherever you are in the world, please have yourselves an absolute cracker of a day. I hope you will. Hope you're happy. Be merry, be silly. And until next time, geeks and geekettes, please always remember, cosplayers do it best.